You can't say, you know, snorted Panks, taking one of his dirty hands out of his rusty iron-grey pockets to bite his nails, if he could find any, and turning his beads of eyes upon his employer. Whether they're poor or not, they say they are, but they all say that. When a man says he's rich, you're generally sure he isn't. Besides, if they are poor, you can't help it. You'd be poor yourself if you didn't get your rents. True enough, said Arthur. You're not going to keep open house for all the poor of London, pursued Panks. You're not going to lodge 'em for nothing. You're not going to open your gates wide and let 'em come free. Not if you know it. You ain't. Mr. Casby shook his head in placid and benignant generality. If a man takes a room for you at £0.50 a week, and when the week comes round hasn't got the £0.50, you say to that man, why have you got the room then? If you haven't got the one thing, why have you got the other? What have you been and done with your money? What do you mean by it? What are you up to? That's what you say to a man of that sort, and if you didn't say it, more shame for you. Mr. Panks made a singular and startling noise produced by a strong blowing effort in the region of the nose, unattended by any result but that acoustic one. You have some extent of such property about the east and north-east here, I believe? Said Clennam, doubtful which of the two to address. Oh, pretty well, said Panks. You're not particular to east or north-east. Any point of the compass will do for you. What you want is a good investment and a quick return. You take it where you can find it. You ain't nice as to situation, not you. There was a fourth and most original figure in the patriarchal tent, who also appeared before dinner. This was an amazing little old woman with a face like a staring wooden doll, too cheap for expression, and with a stiff yellow wig perched unevenly on the top of her head, as if the child who owned the doll had driven a tack through it anywhere, so that it only got fastened on. Another remarkable thing in this little old woman was that the same child seemed to have damaged her face in 2 or 3 places with some blunt instrument in the nature of a spoon, her countenance, and particularly the tip of her nose, presenting the phenomena of several dints, generally answering to the bowl of that article. A further remarkable thing in this little old woman was that she had no name but Mrs. F's aunt. She broke upon the visitor's view under the following circumstances. Flora said when the first dish was being put on the table, perhaps Mr. Clennam might not have heard that Mr. F had left her a legacy. Clennam, in return, implied his hope that Mr. F had endowed the wife whom he adored with the greater part of his worldly substance, if not with all. Flora said, oh yes, she didn't mean that. Mr. F had made a beautiful will, but he had left her as a separate legacy his aunt. She then went out of the room to fetch the legacy, and on her return rather triumphantly presented Mr. F's aunt. The major characteristics discoverable by the stranger in Mr. F's aunt were extreme severity and grim taciturnity, sometimes interrupted by a propensity to offer remarks in a deep, warning voice, which, being totally uncalled for by anything said by anybody, and traceable to no association of ideas, confounded and terrified the mind. Mr. F's aunt may have thrown in these observations on some system of her own, and it may have been ingenious or even subtle, but the key to it was wanted. The neatly served and well-cooked dinner, for everything about the patriarchal household promoted quiet digestion, began with some soup, some fried soles, a butterboat of shrimp sauce, and a dish of potatoes. The conversation still turned on the receipt of rents. Mr. F's aunt, after regarding the company for 10 minutes with a malevolent gaze, delivered the following fearful remark. When we lived at Henley, Barnes's gander was stole by tinkers. Mr. Panks courageously nodded his head and said, All right, ma'am, but the effect of this mysterious communication upon Clennam was absolutely to frighten him, and another circumstance invested this old lady with peculiar terrors. Though she was always staring, she never acknowledged that she saw any individual. The polite and attentive stranger would desire, say, to consult her inclinations on the subject of potatoes. His expressive action would be hopelessly lost upon her, And what could he do? No man could say, "Mr. F.'s aunt, will you permit me?" Every man retired from the spoon as Clennam did, cowed and baffled. There was mutton, a steak, and an apple pie, nothing in the remotest way connected with ganders. And the dinner went on like a disenchanted feast, as it truly was. Once upon a time Clennam had sat at that table, taking no heed of anything but Flora. Now the principal heed he took of Flora was to observe, against his will, that she was very fond of porter, that she combined a great deal of sherry with sentiment, and that if she were a little overgrown, it was upon substantial grounds. The last of the patriarchs had always been a mighty eater, and he disposed of an immense quantity of solid food with the benignity of a good soul who was feeding someone else. Mr. Panks, who was always in a hurry, and who referred at intervals to a little dirty notebook which he kept beside him, perhaps containing the names of the defaulters he meant to look up by way of dessert, took in his victuals much as if he were coaling, with a good deal of noise, a good deal of dropping about, and a puff and a snort, occasionally, as if he were nearly ready to steam away. All through dinner, Flora combined her present appetite for eating and drinking with her past appetite for romantic love, in a way that made Clennam afraid to lift his eyes from his plate, since he could not look towards her without receiving some glance of mysterious meaning or warning, as if they were engaged in a plot. Mr. F.'s aunt sat silently defying him, with an aspect of the greatest bitterness, until the removal of the cloth and the appearance of the decanters, when she originated another observation, struck into the conversation like a clock, without consulting anybody. Flora had just said, "Mr. Clennam, will you give me a glass of port for Mr. F.'s aunt?" "The monument near London Bridge," that lady instantly proclaimed, "was put up after the Great Fire of London, and the Great Fire of London was not the fire in which your Uncle George's workshops was burned down." Mr. Panks, with his former courage, said, "Indeed, ma'am, all right," but appearing to be incensed by imaginary contradiction or other ill usage, Mr. F.'s aunt, instead of relapsing into silence, made the following additional proclamation: "I hate a fool." She imparted to this sentiment, in itself almost Solomonic, so extremely injurious and personal a character by levelling it straight at the visitor's head that it became necessary to lead Mr. F.'s aunt from the room. This was quietly done by Flora, Mr. F.'s aunt offering no resistance, but inquiring on her way out, "What he come there for, then?" with implacable animosity. When Flora returned, she explained that her legacy was a clever old lady, but was sometimes a little singular, and took dislikes, peculiarities of which Flora seemed to be proud rather than otherwise. As Flora's good nature shone in the case, Clennam had no fault to find with the old lady for eliciting it, now that he was relieved from the terrors of her presence, and they took a glass or two of wine in peace. Foreseeing then that the Panks would shortly get under way, and that the patriarch would go to sleep, he pleaded the necessity of visiting his mother, and asked Mr. Panks in which direction he was going. "Cityward, sir," said Panks. "Shall we walk together?" said Arthur. "Quite agreeable," said Panks. Meanwhile Flora was murmuring in rapid snatches for his ear that there was a time, and that the past was a yawning gulf, however, and that a golden chain no longer bound him, and that she revered the memory of the late Mr. F., and that she should be at home tomorrow at 1:30, and the decrees of fate were beyond recall, and that she considered nothing so improbable as that he ever walked on the northwest side of Gray's Inn Gardens at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He tried at parting to give his hand in frankness to the existing Flora, not the vanished Flora or the mermaid, but Flora wouldn't have it, couldn't have it, was wholly destitute of the power of separating herself and him from their bygone characters. He left the house miserably enough, and so much more light-headed than ever, that, if it had not been his good fortune to be towed away, he might, for the first quarter of an hour, have drifted anywhere. When he began to come to himself in the cooler air and the absence of Flora, he found Panks at full speed, cropping such scanty pasturage of nails as he could find, and snorting at intervals. These, in conjunction with one hand in his pocket and his roughened hat hind side before, were evidently the conditions under which he reflected. "A fresh night," said Arthur. "Yes, it's pretty fresh," assented Panks. "As a stranger you feel the climate more than I do, I dare say. Indeed, I haven't got time to feel it." "You lead such a busy life?" "Yes, I always some of them to look up or something to look after. But I like business," said Panks, getting on a little faster. "What's a man made for?" "For nothing else," said Clennam. Panks put the counter-question. "What else?" It packed up in the smallest compass, a weight that had rested on Clennam's life, and he made no answer. "That's what I ask our weekly tenants," said Panks. "Some of 'em will pull long faces to me and say, 'Poor as you see us, master, we're always grinding, drudging, toiling every minute we're awake.' I say to them, 'What else are you made for?' It shuts 'em up. They haven't a word to answer. 'What else are you made for?' That clinches it." "Ah, dear, dear, dear," sighed Clennam. "Here am I," said Panks, pursuing his argument with the weekly tenant. "What else do you suppose I think I'm made for? Nothing. Rattle me out of bed early, set me going, give me as short a time as you like to bolt my meals in, and keep me at it. Keep me always at it, and I'll keep you always at it. You keep somebody else always at it. There you are with the whole duty of man in a commercial country." When they had walked a little further in silence, Clennam said, "Have you no taste for anything, Mr. Panks?" "What's taste?" dryly retorted Panks. "Let us say inclination." "I have an inclination to get money, sir," said Panks, "if you will show me how." He blew off that sound again, and it occurred to his companion for the first time that it was his way of laughing. He was a singular man in all respects. He might not have been quite in earnest, but that the short, hard, rapid manner in which he shot out these cinders of principles, as if it were done by mechanical revolvency, seemed irreconcilable with banter. "You are no great reader, I suppose?" said Clennam. "Never read anything but letters and accounts. Never collect anything but advertisements relative to next of kin. If that's a taste, I have got that. You're not of the Clennams of Cornwall, Mr. Clennam?" "Not that I ever heard of." "I know you're not. I asked your mother, sir. She has too much character to let a chance escape her." "Supposing I had been of the Clennams of Cornwall?" "You'd have heard of something to your advantage." "Indeed, I have heard of little enough to my advantage for some time." "There's a Cornish property going a-begging, sir, and not a Cornish Clennam to have it for the asking," said Panks, taking his notebook from his breast-pocket and putting it in again. "I turn off here. I wish you good night." "Good night," said Clennam. But the tug, suddenly lightened and untrammelled by having any weight in tow, was already puffing away into the distance. They had crossed Smithfield together, and Clennam was left alone at the corner of Barbican. He had no intention of presenting himself in his mother's dismal room that night, and could not have felt more depressed and cast away if he had been in a wilderness. He turned slowly down Aldersgate Street, and was pondering his way along towards St. Paul's, purposing to come into one of the great thoroughfares for the sake of their light and life, when a crowd of people flocked towards him on the same pavement, and he stood aside against a shop to let them pass. As they came up, he made out that they were gathered around a something that was carried on men's shoulders. He soon saw that it was a litter, hastily made of a shutter or some such thing, and a recumbent figure upon it, and the scraps of conversation in the crowd, and a muddy bundle carried by one man, and a muddy hat carried by another, informed him that an accident had occurred. The litter stopped under a lamp before it had passed him half a dozen paces, for some readjustment of the burden, and the crowd stopping too, he found himself in the midst of the array. "An accident going to the hospital?" he asked an old man beside him who stood shaking his head, inviting conversation. "Yes," said the man, "along them mails. They ought to be prosecuted and fined, them mails. They come a-racing out of Lad Lane and Wood Street at 12 or 14 mile an hour, them mails do. The only wonder is that people ain't killed oftener by them mails. This person is not killed, I hope?" "I dunno," said the man. "It ain't for the want of will in them mails, if he ain't." The speaker, having folded his arms and set in comfortably to address his depreciation of them mails to any of the bystanders who would listen, several voices, out of pure sympathy with the sufferer, confirmed him, one voice saying to Clennam, "They're a public nuisance, them mails, sir." Another, "I see one of 'em pull up within half an inch of a boy last night." Another, "I see one of 'em go over a cat, sir, and it might have been your own mother," and all representing by implication that if he had happened to possess any public influence, he could not use it better than against them mails. "Why, a native Englishman is put to every night of his life to save his life from them mails," argued the first old man, "and he knows when they're coming round the corner to tear him limb from limb. What can you expect from a poor foreigner who don't know nothing about 'em?" "Is this a foreigner?" said Clennam, leaning forward to look. In the midst of such replies as "Frenchman, sir," "Portuguese, sir," "Dutchman, sir," "Prussian, sir," and other conflicting testimony, he now heard a feeble voice asking, both in Italian and in French, for water. A general remark going round in reply of, "Ah, poor fellow, he says he'll never get over it, no wonder." Clennam begged to be allowed to pass, as he understood the poor creature. He was immediately handed to the front to speak to him. "First, he wants some water," said he, looking round. A dozen good fellows dispersed to get it. "Are you badly hurt, my friend?" he asked the man on the litter in Italian. "Yes, sir, yes, it's my leg, but it pleases me to hear the old music, though I am very bad." "You are a traveller. Stay. See the water. Let me give you some." They had rested the litter on a pile of paving stones. It was at a convenient height from the ground, and by stooping he could lightly raise the head with one hand and hold the glass to his lips with the other. A little, muscular brown man with black hair and white teeth, a lively face, apparently, earrings in his ears. "That's well. You are a traveller?" "Surely, sir." "A stranger in this city?" Surely, altogether I am arrived this unhappy evening." "From what country?" "Marseille." "Why, see there, I also. Almost as much a stranger here as you, though born here. I came from Marseille a little while ago. Don't be cast down." The face looked up at him imploringly as he rose from wiping it and gently replaced the coat that covered the writhing figure. "I won't leave you till you shall be well taken care of. Courage, you will be very much better half an hour hence." "Ah, outro," cried the poor little man in a faintly incredulous tone, and as they took him up, hung out his right hand to give the forefinger a back-handed shake in the air. Arthur Clennam turned, and walking beside the litter and saying an encouraging word now and then, accompanied it to the neighbouring hospital of St. Bartholomew. None of the crowd but the bearers and he being admitted, the disabled man was soon laid on a table in a cool, methodical way, and carefully examined by a surgeon who was near at hand, and as ready to appear as Calamity herself. "He hardly knows an English word," said Clennam. "Is he badly hurt?" "Let us know all about it first," said the surgeon, continuing his examination with a business-like delight in it, "before we pronounce." After trying the leg with a finger and 2 fingers, and 1 hand and 2 hands, and over and under, and up and down, and in this direction and in that, and approvingly remarking on the points of interest to another gentleman who joined him, the surgeon at last clapped the patient on the shoulder and said, "He won't hurt. He'll do very well. It's difficult enough, but we shall not want him to part with his leg this time," which Clennam interpreted to the patient, who was full of gratitude, and in his demonstrative way kissed both the interpreter's hand and the surgeon's several times. "It's a serious injury, I suppose?" said Clennam. "Yes," replied the surgeon, with the thoughtful pleasure of an artist contemplating the work upon his easel. "Yes, it's enough. There's a compound fracture above the knee and a dislocation below. They are both of a beautiful kind." He gave the patient a friendly clap on the shoulder again, as if he really felt that he was a very good fellow indeed, and worthy of all commendation for having broken his leg in a manner interesting to science. "He speaks French?" said the surgeon. "Oh, yes, he speaks French." "He'll be at no loss here, then. You have only to bear a little pain like a brave fellow, my friend, and to be thankful that all goes as well as it does," he added in that tongue, "and you'll walk again to a marvel. Now, let us see whether there's anything else the matter and how our ribs are." There was nothing else the matter, and our ribs were sound. Clennam remained until everything possible to be done had been skilfully and promptly done. The poor belated wanderer in a strange land movingly besought that favour of him, and lingered by the bed to which he was in due time removed until he had fallen into a doze. Even then he wrote a few words for him on his card, where they promised to return tomorrow, and left it to be given to him when he should awake. All these proceedings occupied so long that it struck 11 o'clock at night as he came out at the hospital gate. He had hired a lodging for the present in Covent Garden, and he took the nearest way to that quarter by Snow Hill and Holborn. Left to himself again, after the solicitude and compassion of his last adventure, he was naturally in a thoughtful mood. As naturally, he could not walk on thinking for 10 minutes without recalling Flora. She necessarily recalled to him his life with all its misdirection and little happiness. When he got to his lodging, he sat down before the dying fire, as he had stood at the window of his old room looking out upon the blackened forest of chimneys, and turned his gaze back upon the gloomy vista by which he had come to that stage in his existence. So long, so bare, so blank. No childhood, no youth, except for one remembrance. That one remembrance proved, only that day, to be a piece of folly. It was a misfortune to him, trifle as it might have been to another, for while all that was hard and stern in his recollection remained reality on being proved, was obdurate to the sight and touch, and relaxed nothing of its old indomitable grimness, the one tender recollection of his experience would not bear the same test, and melted away. He had foreseen this on the former night, when he had dreamed with waking eyes, but he had not felt it then, and he had now. He was a dreamer in such wise, because he was a man who had, deep-rooted in his nature, a belief in all the gentle and good things his life had been without. Bred in meanness and hard dealing, this had rescued him to be a man of honourable mind and open hand. Bred in coldness and severity, this had rescued him to have a warm and sympathetic heart. Bred in a creed too darkly audacious to pursue, through its process of reserving the making of man in the image of his Creator to the making of his Creator in the image of an erring man, this had rescued him to judge not, and in humility to be merciful, and have hope and charity. And this saved him still from the whimpering weakness and cruel selfishness of holding that, because such a happiness or such a virtue had not come into his little path or worked well for him, therefore it was not in the great scheme, but was reducible, when found in appearance, to the basest elements. A disappointed mind he had, but a mind too firm and healthy for such unwholesome air. Leaving himself in the dark, it could rise into the light, seeing it shine on others and hailing it. Therefore he sat before his dying fire, sorrowful to think upon the way by which he had come to that night, yet not strewing poison on the way by which other men had come to it. That he should have missed so much, and at his time of life should look so far about him for any staff to bear him company upon his downward journey and cheer it, was a just regret. He looked at the fire from which the blaze departed, from which the afterglow subsided, in which the ashes turned grey, from which they dropped to dust, and thought, how soon I too shall pass through such changes and be gone. To review his life was like descending a green tree in fruit and flower, and seeing all the branches wither and drop off, one by one, as he came down towards them. From the unhappy suppression of my youngest days, through the rigid and unloving home that followed them, through my departure, my long exile, my return, my mother's welcome, my intercourse with her since, down to the afternoon of this day, with poor Flora, said Arthur Clennam. What have I found? His door was softly opened, and these spoken words startled him, and came as if they were an answer. Little Dorrit. Chapter 14. Little Dorrit's Party. Arthur Clennam rose hastily, and saw her standing at the door. This history must sometimes see with little Dorrit's eyes, and shall begin that course by seeing him. Little Dorit looked into a dim room, which seemed a spacious one to her, and grandly furnished. Courtly ideas of Covent Garden as a place with famous coffee-houses, where gentlemen wearing gold-laced coats and swords had quarrelled and fought duels. Costly ideas of Covent Garden as a place where there were flowers in winter at guineas apiece, pineapples at guineas a pound, and peas at guineas a pint. Picturesque ideas of Covent Garden as a place where there was a mighty theatre, showing wonderful and beautiful sights to richly dressed ladies and gentlemen, and which was forever far beyond the reach of poor Fanny or poor uncle. Desolate ideas of Covent Garden as having all those arches in it, where the miserable children in rags among whom she had just now passed, like young rats, slunk and hid, fed on offal, huddled together for warmth, and were hunted about. Look to the rats, young and old, all ye barnacles, for before God they are eating away our foundations, and will bring the roofs on our heads. Teeming ideas of Covent Garden as a place of past and present mystery, romance, abundance, want, beauty, ugliness, fair country gardens, and foul street gutters, all confused together, made the room dimmer than it was in little Dorrit's eyes, as they timidly saw it from the door. At first in the chair before the gone-out fire, and then turned round wondering to see her, was the gentleman whom she sought. The brown, grave gentleman who smiled so pleasantly, who was so frank and considerate in his manner, and yet in whose earnestness there was something that reminded her of his mother, with the great difference that she was earnest in asperity and he in gentleness. Now he regarded her with that attentive and inquiring look before which little Dorrit's eyes had always fallen away, and before which they fell still. "My poor child, here at midnight?" "I said little Dorrit, sir, on purpose to prepare you. I knew you must be very much surprised." "Are you alone?" "No, sir. I have got Maggie with me." Considering her entrance sufficiently prepared for this by mention of her name, Maggie appeared from the landing outside on the broad grin. She instantly suppressed that manifestation, however, and became fixedly solemn. "And I have no fire," said Clennam. "And you are—" He was going to say, "so lightly clad," but stopped himself in what would have been a reference to her poverty, saying instead, "And it is so cold." Putting the chair from which he had risen nearer to the grate, he made her sit down in it, and hurriedly bringing wood and coal, heaped them together and got a blaze. "Your foot is like marble, my child." He had happened to touch it while stooping on one knee at his work of kindling the fire. "Put it nearer the warmth." Little Dorrit thanked him hastily. It was quite warm, it was very warm. It smote upon his heart to feel that she hid her thin, worn shoe. Little Dorrit was not ashamed of her poor shoes. He knew her story, and it was not that. Little Dorrit had a misgiving that he might blame her father if he saw them, that he might think, why did he dine today and leave this little creature to the mercy of the cold stones? She had no belief that it would have been a just reflection. She simply knew by experience that such delusions did sometimes present themselves to people. It was a part of her father's misfortunes that they did. "Before I say anything else," little Dorrit began, sitting before the pale fire, and raising her eyes again to the face which, in its harmonious look of interest and pity and protection, she felt to be a mystery far above her in degree, and almost removed beyond her guessing at. "May I tell you something, sir?" "Yes, my child." A slight shade of distress fell upon her at his so often calling her a child. She was surprised that he should see it or think of such a slight thing, but he said directly, "I wanted a tender word and can think of no other, as you just now gave yourself the name they give you at my mother's, and as that is the name by which I always think of you. Let me call you Little Dorrit." "Thank you, sir. I should like it better than any name." "Little Dorrit." "Little mother," Maggie, who had been falling asleep, put in as a correction. "It's all the same, Maggie," returned Little Dorrit. "All the same." "Is it all the same, mother?" "Just the same." Maggie laughed and immediately snored. In Little Dorrit's eyes and ears, the uncouth figure and the uncouth sound were as pleasant as could be. There was a glow of pride in her big child, overspreading her face, when it again met the eyes of the grave brown gentleman. She wondered what he was thinking of, as he looked at Maggie and her. She thought what a good father he would be, how, with some such look, he would counsel and cherish his daughter. "What I was going to tell you, sir," said Little Dorrit, "is that my brother is at large." Arthur was rejoiced to hear it, and hoped he would do well. "And what I was going to tell you, sir," said Little Dorrit, trembling in all her little figure and in her voice, "is that I am not to know whose generosity released him, am never to ask, and am never to be told, and am never to thank the gentleman with all my grateful heart." "He would probably need no thanks," Clennam said. "Very likely he would be thankful himself, and with reason, that he had had the means and chance of doing a little service to her who well deserved a great one." "And what I was going to say, sir, is," said Little Dorrit, trembling more and more, "that if I knew him, and I might, I would tell him that he can never, never know how I feel his goodness, and how my good father would feel it. And what I was going to say, sir, is that if I knew him, and I might, but I don't know him and I must not, I know that, I would tell him that I shall never more lie down to sleep without having prayed to heaven to bless him and reward him. And if I knew him, and I might, I would go down on my knees to him and take his hand and kiss it, and ask him not to draw it away, but to leave it. Oh, leave it for a moment, and let my thankful tears fall on it, for I have no other thanks to give him." Little Dorrit had put his hand to her lips, and would have kneeled to him, but he gently prevented her and replaced her in her chair. Her eyes and the tones of her voice had thanked him far better than she thought. He was not able to say quite as composedly as usual, "There, Little Dorrit, there. We will suppose that you did know this person, and that you might do all this, and that it was all done. And now tell me, who am quite another person, who am nothing more than the friend who begged you to trust him, why you are out at midnight, and what is it that brings you so far through the streets at this late hour, my slight, delicate—" Child was on his lips again. "Little Dorrit." "Maggie and I have been tonight," she answered, subduing herself with quiet effort that had long been natural to her, "to the theatre where my sister is engaged." "Oh, ain't it an heavenly place?" suddenly interrupted Maggie, who seemed to have the power of going to sleep and waking up whenever she chose. "Almost as good as a hospital, only there ain't no chicken in it." Here she shook herself and fell asleep again. "We went there," said Little Dorrit, glancing at her charge, "because I like sometimes to know of my own knowledge that my sister is doing well, and like to see her there with my own eyes, when neither she nor uncle is aware. It is very solemn indeed that I can do that, because when I am not out at work, I am with my father, and even when I am out at work, I hurry home to him, but I pretend tonight that I am at a party." As she made the confession, timidly hesitating, she raised her eyes to the face, and read its expression so plainly that she answered it. "Oh, no, certainly. I never was at a party in my life." She paused a little under his attentive look, and then said, "I hope there is no harm in it. I could never have been of any use if I had not pretended a little. She feared that he was blaming her in his mind for so devising to contrive for them, think for them, and watch over them without their knowledge or gratitude, perhaps even with their reproaches for supposed neglect. But what was really in his mind was the weak figure with its strong purpose, the thin-worn shoes, the insufficient dress, and the pretence of recreation and enjoyment. He asked where the supposititious party was. At a place where she worked, answered little Dorrit, blushing. She had said very little about it, only a few words to make her father easy. Her father did not believe it to be a grand party. Indeed, he might suppose that, and she glanced for an instant at the shawl she wore. "It is the first night," said little Dorrit, "that I have ever been away from home, and London looks so large, so barren, and so wild." In little Dorrit's eyes, its vastness under the black sky was awful. A tremor passed over her as she said the words. "But this is not," she added, with quiet effort again, "what I have come to trouble you with, sir. My sister's having found a friend, a lady she has told me of, and made me rather anxious about, was the first cause of my coming away from home. And being away and coming on purpose round by where you lived and seeing a light in the window—" Not for the first time. No, not for the first time. In little Dorrit's eyes, the outside of that window had been a distant star on other nights than this. She had toiled out of her way, tired and troubled, to look up at it and wonder about the grave brown gentleman from so far off who had spoken to her as a friend and protector. "There were 3 things," said little Dorrit, "that I thought I would like to say if you were alone and I might come upstairs. First, what I have tried to say, but never can, never shall—" "Hush, hush! That is done with and disposed of. Let us pass to the second," said Clennam, smiling her agitation away, making the blaze shine upon her, and putting wine and cake and fruit towards her on the table. "I think," said little Dorrit, "this is the second thing, sir. I think Mrs. Clennam must have found out my secret, and must know where I come from and where I go to. Where I live, I mean." "Indeed," returned Clennam quickly. He asked her, after short consideration, why she supposed so. "I think," replied little Dorrit, "that Mr. Flintwich must have watched me." "And why?" Clennam asked, as he turned his eyes upon the fire, bent his brows, and considered again. Why did she suppose that? "I have met him twice, both times near home, both times at night when I was going back. Both times I thought, though that may easily be my mistake, that he hardly had looked as if he had met me by accident." "Did he say anything?" "No, he only nodded and put his head on one side." "The devil take his head," mused Clennam, still looking at the fire. "It's always on one side." He roused himself to persuade her to put some wine to her lips and to touch something to eat. It was very difficult. She was so timid and shy, and then said, musing again, "Is my mother at all changed to you?" "Oh, not at all. She is just the same. I wondered whether I had better tell her my history. I wondered whether whether you would like me to tell her. I wondered," said little Dorrit, looking at him in a suppliant way and gradually withdrawing her eyes as he looked at her, "whether you would advise me what I ought to do." "Little Dorrit," said Clennam, and the phrase had already begun between these two to stand for 100 gentle phrases, according to the varying tone and connection in which it was used. "Do nothing. I will have some talk with my old friend, Mrs. Affery. Do nothing, little Dorrit, except refresh yourself with such means as there are here. I entreat you to do that." "Thank you. I am not hungry, nor," said little Dorrit, as he softly put her glass towards her, "nor thirsty. I think Maggie might like something, perhaps." "We will make her find pockets presently for all there is here," said Clennam. "But before we awake her, there was a third thing to say." "Yes. You will not be offended, sir. I promise that, unreservedly. It will sound strange. I hardly know how to say it. Don't think it unreasonable or ungrateful in me," said little Dorrit, with returning and increasing agitation. "No, no, no. I am sure it will be natural and right. I am not afraid that I shall put a wrong construction on it, whatever it is." "Thank you. You are coming back to see my father again? Yes. You have been so good and thoughtful as to write him a note saying that you are coming tomorrow. Oh, that was nothing, yes. Can you guess, said Little Dorrit, folding her small hands tight in one another and looking at him with all the earnestness of her soul, looking steadily out of her eyes, what I am going to ask you not to do? I think I can, but I may be wrong. No, you are not wrong, said Little Dorrit, shaking her head. If we should want it so very, very badly that we cannot do without it, let me ask you for it. I will. Don't encourage me to ask. Don't understand him if he does ask. Don't give it to him. Save him and spare him that, and you will be able to think better of him. Clennam said, not very plainly, seeing those tears glistening in her anxious eyes, that her wish should be sacred with him. You don't know what he is, she said. You don't know what he really is. How can you, seeing him there all at once, dear love, and not gradually as I have done? You have been good to us, so delicately and truly good, that I want him to be better in your eyes than in anybody's. And I cannot bear to think, cried Little Dorrit, covering her tears with her hands, I cannot bear to think that you of all the world should see him in his only moments of degradation. Pray, said Clennam, do not be so distressed. Pray, Little Dorrit. This is quite understood now. Thank you, sir. Thank you. I have tried very much to keep myself from saying this. I have thought about it days and nights, but when I knew for certain that you were coming again, I made up my mind to speak to you. Not because I am ashamed of him. She dried her tears quickly, but because I know him better than anyone does and love him and am proud of him. Relieved of this weight, Little Dorrit was nervously anxious to be gone. Maggie being broad awake and in the act of distantly gloating over the fruit and cakes with chuckles of anticipation, Clennam made the best diversion in his power by pouring her out a glass of wine, which she drank in a series of loud smacks, putting her hand upon her windpipe after everyone and saying, breathless, with her eyes in a prominent state, "Oh, ain't it delicious? Ain't it hospitally?" When she had finished the wine and these encomiums, she charged to her load her basket. She was never without her basket, with every eatable thing upon the table, and to take especial care to leave no scrap behind. Maggie's pleasure in doing this, and her little mother's pleasure in seeing Maggie pleased, was as good a turn as circumstances could have given to the late conversation. "But the gates will have been locked long ago," said Clennam, suddenly remembering it. "Where are you going?" "I am going to Maggie's lodging," answered Little Dorrit. "I shall be quite safe, quite well taken care of." "I must accompany you there," said Clennam. "I cannot let you go alone." "Yes, pray leave us to go there by ourselves. Pray do," begged Little Dorrit. She was so earnest in the petition that Clennam felt a delicacy in obtruding himself upon her, the rather because he could well understand that Maggie's lodging was of the obscurest sort. "Come, Maggie," said Little Dorrit cheerily. "We shall do very well. We know the way by this time, Maggie." Yes, little mother, we know the way," chuckled Maggie, and away they went. Little Dorrit turned at the door to say, "God bless you." She said it very softly, but perhaps she may have been as audible above, who knows, as a whole cathedral choir. Arthur Clennam suffered them to pass the corner of the street before he followed at a distance, not with any idea of encroaching a second time on Little Dorrit's privacy, but to satisfy his mind by seeing her secure in the neighbourhood to which she was accustomed. So diminutive she looked, so fragile and defenceless against the bleak damp weather, flitting along in the shuffling shadow of her charge, that he felt in his compassion and in his habit considering her a child apart from the rest of the rough world, as if he would have been glad to take her up in his arms and carry her to her journey's end. In course of time she came into the leading thoroughfare where the Marshalsea was, and then he saw them slacken their pace and soon turn down a by-street. He stopped, felt that he had no right to go further, and slowly left them. He had no suspicion that they ran any risk of being houseless until morning, had no idea of the truth until long, long afterwards. But said little Dorrit, when they stopped at a poor dwelling all in darkness, and heard no sound on listening at the door. "Now this is a good lodging for you, Maggie, and we must not give offence. Consequently, we will only knock twice, and not very loud, and if we cannot wake them so, we must walk about till day." Once little Dorrit knocked with a careful hand and listened. Twice little Dorrit knocked with a careful hand and listened. All was close and still. "Maggie, we must do the best we can, my dear. We must be patient and wait for day." It was a chill, dark night, with a damp wind blowing, when they came out into the leading street again and heard the clock strike 1:30. "In only 5 hours and a half," said little Dorrit, "we shall be able to go home." To speak of home and to go and look at it, being so near, was a natural sequence. They went to the closed gate and peeped through into the courtyard. "I hope he is sound asleep," said little Dorrit, kissing one of the bars, "and does not miss me." The gate was so familiar and so like a companion that they put down Maggie's basket in a corner to serve for a seat, and keeping close together, rested there for some time. While the street was empty and silent, little Dorrit was not afraid, but when she heard a footstep at a distance or saw a moving shadow among the street lamps, she was startled and whispered, "Maggie, I see someone. Come away." Maggie would then wake up more or less fretfully, and they would wander about a little and come back again. As long as eating was a novelty and an amusement, Maggie kept up pretty well. But that period going by, she became querulous about the cold, and shivered and whimpered. "It will soon be over, dear," said little Dorrit patiently. "Oh, it's all very fine for you, little mother," returned Maggie, "but I am a poor thing, only 10 years old." At last, in the dead of night, when the street was very still indeed, little Dorrit laid the heavy head upon her bosom, and soothed her to sleep. And thus she sat at the gate, as it were alone, looking up at the stars, and seeing the clouds pass over them in their wild flight, which was the dance at little Dorrit's party. If it really was a party, she thought once, as she sat there, if it was light and warm and beautiful, and it was our house, and my poor dear was its master, and had never been inside these walls, and if Mr. Clennam was one of our visitors, and we were dancing to delightful music, and were all as gay and light-hearted as ever we could be, I wonder— Such a vista of wonder opened out before her, that she sat looking up at the stars, quite lost, until Maggie was querulous again, and wanted to get up and walk. 3 o'clock, and 3:30, and they had passed over London Bridge. They had heard the rush of the tide against obstacles, and looked down, awed, through the dark vapour on the river, had seen little spots of lighted water where the bridge lamps were reflected, shining like demon eyes with a terrible fascination in them for guilt and misery. They had shrunk past homeless people lying coiled up in nooks. They had run from drunkards. They had started from slinking men, whistling and signing to one another at by-corners or running away at full speed. Though everywhere the leader and the guide, little Dorrit, happy for once in her youthful appearance, feigned to cling and rely upon Maggie, and more than once some voice from among a knot of brawling or prowling figures in their path had called out to the rest to "let the woman and the child go by." So the woman and the child had gone by and gone on, and 5 had sounded from the steeples. They were walking slowly towards the east, already looking for the first pale streak of day, when a woman came after them. "What are you doing with the child?" she said to Maggie. She was young, far too young to be there, heaven knows, and neither ugly nor wicked-looking. She spoke coarsely, but with no naturally coarse voice. There was even something musical in its sound. "What are you doing with yourself?" retorted Maggie, for want of a better answer. "Can't you see without my telling you?" "I don't know as I can," said Maggie. "Killing myself. Now I have answered you, answer me. What are you doing with the child?" The supposed child kept her head drooped down, and kept her form close at Maggie's side. "Poor thing," said the woman. "Have you no feeling that you keep her out in the cruel streets at such a time as this? Have you no eyes that you don't see how delicate and slender she is? Have you no sense you don't look as if you had much, that you don't take more pity on this cold and trembling little hand?" She had stepped across to that side and held the hand between her own two, chafing it. "Kiss a poor lost creature, dear," she said, bending her face, "and tell me, where's she taking you?" Little Dorrit turned towards her. "Why, my God," she said, recoiling, "you're a woman." "Don't mind that," said Little Dorrit, clasping one of her hands that had suddenly released hers. "I am not afraid of you." "Then you had better be," she answered. "Have you no mother?" "No." "No father?" "Yes, a very dear one." "Go home to him and be afraid of me. Let me go. Good night." "I must thank you first. Let me speak to you as if I really were a child." "You can't do it," said the woman. "You are kind and innocent, but you can't look at me out of a child's eyes. I never should have touched you, but I thought you were a child." And with a strange, wild cry, she went away. No day yet in the sky, but there was day in the resounding stones of the streets, in the wagons, carts, and coaches, in the workers going to various occupations, in the opening of early shops, in the traffic at markets, in the stir of the riverside. There was a coming day in the flaring lights, with a feebler colour in them than they would have had at another time, coming day in the increased sharpness of the air and the ghastly dying of the night. They went back again to the gate, intending to wait there now until it should be opened. But the air was so raw and cold that Little Dorrit, leading Maggie about in her sleep, kept in motion. Going round by the church, she saw lights there, and the door opened, and went up the steps and looked in. "Who's that?" cried a stout old man, who was putting on a nightcap as if he were going to bed in a vault. "It's no one in particular, sir," said Little Dorrit. "Stop," cried the man. "Let's have a look at you." This caused her to turn back again in the act of going out, and to present herself and her charge before him. "I thought so," said he. "I know you." "We have often seen each other," said Little Dorrit, recognizing the sexton or the beadle or the verger or whatever he was, "when I have been at church here. More than that, we've got your birth in our register, you know. You're one of our curiosities." "Indeed," said Little Dorrit. "To be sure, as the child of the— By the by, how did you get out so early?" "We were shut out last night, and were waiting to get in." "You don't mean it. And there's another hour good yet? Come into the vestry. You'll find a fire in the vestry on account of the painters. I'm waiting for the painters, or I shouldn't be here, you may depend on it. One of our curiosities mustn't be cold when we have it in our power to warm her up comfortable. Come along." He was a very good old fellow in his familiar way, and having stirred the vestry fire, he looked round the shelves of registers for a particular volume. "Here you are, you see," he said, taking it down and turning the leaves. "Here you'll find yourself as large as life. Amy, daughter of William and Fanny Dorrit, born Marshalsea Prison, parish of St. George, and we tell people that you have lived there without so much as a day or a night's absence ever since. Is it true?" "Quite true till last night." "Lord!" But his surveying her with an admiring gaze suggested something else to him, to wit, "I'm sorry to see, though, that you are faint and tired. Stay a bit. I'll get some cushions out of the church, and you and your friends shall lie down before the fire. Don't be afraid of not going in to join your father when the gates open. I'll call you." He soon brought in the cushions and strewed them on the ground. "There you are, you see. Again as large as life. Oh, never mind thanking. I've daughters of my own, and though they weren't born in the Marshalsea prison, they might have been, if I had been in my ways of carrying on of your father's breed. Stop a bit. I must put something under the cushion for your head. Here's a burial volume, just the thing. We have got Mrs. Bangham in this book, but what makes these books interesting to most people is not who's in 'em, but who isn't. Who's coming, you know, and when. That's the interesting question." Commendingly looking back at the pillow he had improvised, he left them to their hour's repose. Maggie was snoring already, and Little Dorrit was soon fast asleep with her head resting on that sealed book of fate, untroubled by its mysterious blank leaves. This was Little Dorrit's party. The shame, desertion, wretchedness, and exposure of the great capital. The wet, the cold, the slow hours, and the swift clouds of the dismal night. This was the party from which little Dorrit went home, jaded in the first grey mist of a rainy morning. Chapter 15. Mrs Flintwich Has Another Dream. The debilitated old house in the city, wrapped in its mantle of soot, and leaning heavily on the crutches that had partaken of its decay, and worn out with it, never knew a healthy or cheerful interval, let what would betide. If the sun never touched it, it was but with a ray, and that was gone in half an hour. If the moonlight ever fell upon it, it was only to put a few patches on its doleful cloak, and make it look more wretched. The stars, to be sure, coldly watched it when the nights and the smoke were clear enough, and all bad weather stood by it with a rare fidelity. You should alike find rain, hail, frost, and thaw lingering in that dismal enclosure when they had vanished from other places, and as to snow, you should see it there for weeks, long after it had changed from yellow to black, slowly weeping away its grimy life. The place had no other adherents. As to street noises, the rumbling of wheels in the lane merely rushed in at the gateway in going past, and rushed out again, making the listening Mistress Affery feel as if she were deaf, and recovered the sense of hearing by instantaneous flashes. So with whistling, singing, talking, laughing, and all pleasant human sounds. They leapt the gap in a moment, and went upon their way. The varying light of fire and candle in Mrs. Clennam's room made the greatest change that ever broke the dead monotony of the spot. In her two long narrow windows the fire shone sullenly all day and sullenly all night. On rare occasions it flashed up passionately, as she did, but for the most part it was suppressed, like her, and preyed upon itself evenly and slowly. During many hours of the short winter days, however, when it was dusk there early in the afternoon, changing distortions of herself in her wheeled chair, of Mr. Flintwich with his wry neck, of Mistress Affery coming and going, would be thrown upon the house wall that was over the gateway, and would hover there like shadows from a great magic lantern. As the room-ridden invalid settled for the night, there would gradually disappear, Mistress Affery's magnified shadow always flitting about last, until it finally glided away into the air as though she were off upon a witch excursion. Then the solitary light would burn unchangingly, until it burned pale before the dawn, and at last died under the breath of Mrs. Affery, as her shadow descended on it from the witch region of sleep. Strange, if the little sick-room fire were in effect a beacon fire, summoning someone, and that the most unlikely someone in the world, to the spot that must be come to. Strange if the little sick-room light were in effect a watch-light, burning in that place every night until an appointed event should be watched out. Which of the vast multitude of travellers under the sun and the stars, climbing the dusty hills and toiling along the weary plains, journeying by land and journeying by sea, coming and going so strangely to meet and to act and react on one another, which of the host may, with no suspicion of the journey's end, be travelling surely hither? Time shall show us. The post of honour and the post of shame, the general's station and the drummer's, a peer's statue in Westminster Abbey and a seaman's hammock in the bosom of the deep, the mitre and the workhouse, the woolsack and the gallows, the throne and the guillotine, the travellers to all are on the great high road, but it has wonderful divergencies, and only time shall show us whither each traveller is bound. On a wintry afternoon at twilight, Mrs. Flintwich, having been heavy all day, dreamed this dream. She thought she was in the kitchen getting the kettle ready for tea, and was warming herself with her feet upon the fender and the skirt of her gown tucked up, before the collapsed fire in the middle of the grate, bordered on either side by a deep cold black ravine. She thought that as she sat thus, musing upon the question whether life was not for some people a rather dull invention, she was frightened by a sudden noise behind her. She thought that she had been similarly frightened once last week, and that the noise was of a mysterious kind, a sound of rustling and of 3 or 4 quick beats like a rapid step, while a shock or tremble was communicated to her heart, as if the step had shaken the floor, or even if she had been touched by some awful hand. She thought that this revived within her certain old fears of hers that the house was haunted, and that she flew up the kitchen stairs without knowing how she got up, to be nearer company. Mistress Affery thought that on reaching the hall she saw the door of her liege's lord's office standing open and the room empty, that she went to the ripped-up window in the little room by the street door to connect her palpitating heart through the glass with living things beyond and outside the haunted house, that she then saw on the wall over the gateway the shadows of the 2 clever ones in conversation above, that she then went upstairs with her shoes in her hand, partly to be near the clever ones as a match for most ghosts, and partly to hear what they were talking about. "None of your nonsense with me," said Mr. Flintwich. "I won't take it from you." Mrs. Flintwich dreamed that she stood behind the door, which was just ajar, and most distinctly heard her husband say these bold words. "Flintwich," returned Mrs. Clennam, in her usual strong low voice, "there is a demon of anger in you. Guard against it." "I don't care whether there's 1 or a dozen," said Mr. Flintwich, forcibly suggesting in his tone that the higher number was nearer the mark. "If there was 50, they should all say, 'None of your nonsense with me. I won't take it from you.' I make 'em say it, whether they liked it or not." "What have I done, you wrathful man?" her strong voice asked. "Done?" said Mr. Flintwich. "Dropped down upon me? If you mean remonstrated with you, don't put words into my mouth that I don't mean," said Jeremiah, sticking to his figurative expression with tenacious and impenetrable obstinacy. "I mean dropped down upon me." "I remonstrated with you," she began again, "because—" "I won't have it," cried Jeremiah. "You dropped down upon me." "I dropped down upon you then, you ill-conditioned man." Jeremiah chuckled at having forced her to adopt his phrase. "For having been needlessly significant to Arthur that morning, I have a right to complain of it as almost a breach of confidence. You did not mean it." "I won't have it," interposed the contradictory Jeremiah, flinging back the concession. "I did mean it." "I suppose I must leave you to speak in soliloquy if you choose," she replied, after a pause that seemed an angry one. "It is useless my addressing myself to a rash and headstrong old man who has a set purpose not to hear me." "Now, I won't take that from you either," said Jeremiah. "I have no such purpose. I have told you I did mean it. Do you wish to know why I meant it, you rash and headstrong old woman?" "After all, you only restore me in my own words," she said, struggling with her indignation. "Yes." "This is why, then. Because you hadn't cleared his father to him, and you ought to have done it. Because before you went into any tantrum about yourself, who are—" "Hold there, Flintwich," she cried out in a changed voice. "You may go a word too far." The old man seemed to think so. There was another pause, and he had altered his position in the room, when he spoke again more mildly. "I was going to tell you why it was. Because before you took your own part, I thought you ought to have taken the part of Arthur's father." "Arthur's father? I had no particular love for Arthur's father. I served Arthur's father's uncle in this house when Arthur's father was not much above me, was poor as far as his pocket went, and when his uncle might as soon have left me his heir as left him. He starved in the parlour, and I starved in the kitchen, and that was the principal difference in our positions. There was not much more than a flight of breakneck stairs between us. I never took to him in those times. I don't know that I ever took to him greatly at any time. He was an undecided, irresolute chap, who had everything but his orphan life scared out of him when he was young, and when he brought you home here, the wife his uncle had named for him, I didn't need to look at you twice. You were a good-looking woman at the time, to know who'd be master. You have stood of your own strength ever since. Stand by your own strength now. Don't lean against the dead." "I do not, as you call it, lean against the dead." "But you had a mind to do it, if I had submitted," growled Jeremiah, "and that's why you dropped down upon me. You can't forget that I didn't submit. I suppose you are astonished that I should consider it worth my while to have justice done to Arthur's father, eh? It doesn't matter whether you answer or not, because I know you are, and you know you are. Come, then, I'll tell you how it is. I may be a bit of an oddity in point of temper, but this is my temper. I can't let anybody have entirely their own way. You are a determined woman and a clever woman, and when you see your purpose before you, nothing will turn you from it.